1177. The burning sands of the Levant shook under the march of Saladin's huge army. Tens of thousands of soldiers, flags, and war horses were all moving toward one goal: to wipe Jerusalem off the map. And standing in their way were only about 500 knights, tired, outnumbered, and led by a king who was already dying from leprosy. He was just a 16-year-old boy whose body was weak, but whose will refused to break. He gathered his last warriors, raised his banner high, and charged straight toward Saladin's army. What happened next wasn't a miracle from God, but a miracle of courage, timing, and unshakable determination. It was the day when 500 knights defeated Saladin's great army. To understand the impossible odds at the Battle of Montgisard, you first need to know about the two men at the center of it all. One was at the height of his power. The other was like a candle flickering in a storm. The first was Saladin, Yusuf ibn Ayyub. By 1177, he was the most powerful Muslim ruler in the Middle East. He had skillfully risen from being a general to becoming the Sultan of Egypt, uniting much of the Islamic world under his banner. Saladin wasn't just a conqueror, he was a smart strategist and a charming leader who believed it was his sacred duty to take back Jerusalem. He had spent years building a strong, professional army, and now he was ready to strike a final, powerful blow. His opponent was a sad contrast: Baldwin IV, the King of Jerusalem. He became king at just 13 years old, but his rule was haunted by a terrible secret. Baldwin had leprosy. In those days, people saw that disease as a punishment from God. For a warrior king, it was a terrible fate. He was losing feeling in his arms and legs, and his hands and face were becoming deformed. Yet he refused to give up. He learned to control his horse using only his knees, becoming a skilled rider despite his illness. He was smart, brave, and had a will of iron that fought against his failing body. But courage alone couldn't protect a kingdom. By late 1177, the kingdom of Jerusalem was in great danger. Most of its army was far to the north on a campaign in Syria that had already failed. This mistake left Jerusalem's southern border, right next to Saladin's stronghold in Egypt, almost completely unprotected. Saladin, always quick to act, saw his chance. The sick king was alone. The Christian army was split. The path to Jerusalem was wide open. It was the perfect opportunity, so he launched a full invasion, aiming right at the heart of the Crusader kingdom. When news of the invasion reached Jerusalem, people were not just worried, they were terrified. One writer said the whole city fell into despair. Saladin's army was a terrifying sight, a huge moving force of about 20,000 men, including around 1,000 elite Mamluks, slave soldiers trained since childhood to be the best warriors. They crossed the desert quickly, like a storm of sand and steel. In Jerusalem, panic spread. The city's main army was far away, but King Baldwin refused to just sit and wait. In a desperate act of courage, he called every able-bodied Christian man to fight for the kingdom. The response was small. Baldwin managed to gather only a tiny force. According to the historian William of Tyre, he had just 375 knights, including infantry and other soldiers. His total army was only between 3,000 and 5,000 men, the kingdom's last hope. Most leaders would have hidden behind Jerusalem's strong walls and prayed for a miracle. But Baldwin chose a different path. He made a bold and risky choice to march his small army out to face Saladin head-on. His goal was the fortress of Ashkelon, a stronghold directly in Saladin's path. It was a crazy gamble. As Baldwin's small army reached the fortress, the first of Saladin's troops appeared. Baldwin and his men were forced to take shelter inside, trapping themselves. From Saladin's point of view, everything was going perfectly. The main Crusader army was gone. The sick king and his few knights had locked themselves inside Ashkelon, where a small part of Saladin's army could easily keep them trapped. To Saladin, the war was already won. But his confidence made him careless, dangerously careless, thinking King Baldwin was no threat. Saladin didn't bother to attack Ashkelon. He left a small group to block the fortress and led most of his army toward Jerusalem. But his overconfidence led to mistakes. Believing no one could stop him, he let his army spread out to loot the rich lands around Ramlah. Lida and Asef, his once well-organized army, turned into scattered raiding groups. He was now marching through enemy land almost blind. But inside Ashkelon, the Crusaders were not just sitting and waiting. They were joined by about 80 Knights Templar, the most disciplined and feared heavy cavalry in all of Christendom. From the fortress walls, they watched Saladin's main army march past, scattered and overconfident. They saw how undisciplined the troops were. They saw how spread out the formations had become, and they saw an opportunity. It was a near suicidal chance, but it was the only one they had. With the force blocking them now much smaller, Baldwin and his knights burst out of the fortress, easily defeating the small group Saladin had left behind. They joined with the Templars, who had come from nearby Gaza. Suddenly, the hunter became the hunted. Baldwin's small, united army now began following Saladin's large, scattered, and unsuspecting forces. But the Crusaders didn't attack blindly. Baldwin and his commanders knew that a straight fight on open ground would be suicide. Their only hope was to use the land to their advantage. So they followed the Ayyubid army, marching up the coast before turning inland. Searching for the perfect place to fight, they found it near a hill called Montgisard, probably near modern Tel Aviv, close to Ramla. The land there was uneven and marshy, a natural trap that would force a big army to bunch up, causing chaos in its lines. It was the perfect place for a smaller, disciplined force to fight a stronger one. On November 25th, the Crusaders caught Saladin's army in this perfect trap. The Ayyubid forces were completely unprepared, still marching in columns and struggling with the muddy ground. Their horses were tired from days of travel and looting. Saladin was totally surprised. He rushed to get his soldiers into battle formation. At that moment, Baldwin gave a sacred order. The Bishop of Bethlehem raised a piece of the true cross they had brought with them. In a powerful moment, the 16-year-old king was helped off his horse. He fell to the ground and prayed before the holy relic, asking God for victory. When he stood up again, his men were deeply moved by the sight of their young, sick king ready to lead them into almost certain death. They shouted in courage and faith. With his hands bandaged to cover his sores, Baldwin rode to the front of his army. The knights formed a tight wedge of heavy cavalry. The Knights Templar stood at the very tip of the formation. Then, with a full-throated roar, they charged straight at the heart of Saladin's half-formed lines. The shock was total. The Ayyubid line shattered on impact. The Crusader charge didn't just hit the enemy, it broke through them completely, destroying their order. The front line collapsed almost instantly. Panic swept through the disorganized soldiers still trying to form ranks. Saladin tried desperately to restore control, but it was hopeless. His army was no longer a fighting force, it was a frightened crowd. The disciplined Knights Templar kept attacking without mercy, giving the enemy no time to regroup. Saladin's own elite Mamluk guards fought fiercely just to protect him from being killed or captured. In the chaos, Saladin's nephew, Taqi al-Din's son Ahmad, was killed. Baldwin knew just winning the field wasn't enough. To save his kingdom, he had to destroy Saladin's army completely. As the Ayyubid lines broke apart, the battle turned into a long, brutal 12-mile chase. It wasn't a battle anymore, it was a slaughter dart. To make things worse for Saladin, heavy rain began to fall, and local Bedouin tribes attacked the fleeing soldiers. Seeing how weak they were, the great Saladin was forced to face the ultimate humiliation. He barely escaped, riding away on a fast camel with only a few bodyguards. The man who had set out to conquer Jerusalem was now running for his life across the same desert he had proudly crossed just weeks earlier. Saladin finally reached Cairo on December 8th, but he returned in shame. The scale of his defeat was almost unbelievable. While the Crusaders lost about 1,000 men killed and 750 wounded, Saladin's losses were catastrophic. Only about 1/10 of his original invasion force made it back to Egypt. All his baggage and supplies were captured. Muslim historians later wrote that the defeat was so terrible it was only made right years later by Saladin's victory at Hattin. The news of the loss shocked the whole region. For the Crusaders, it was seen as nothing less than a miracle. The kingdom's hope, which had been at its lowest point, suddenly rose again. Baldwin IV, the 16-year-old Leper King, became a legend. For Saladin, it was a huge blow. His reputation for being unbeatable was shattered, and he learned a hard lesson about underestimating the Franks and their young king. To celebrate the victory, Baldwin built a monastery on the battlefield dedicated to Saint Catherine, whose feast day happened on the same day as the battle. The victory at Montgisard gave the Kingdom of Jerusalem a very important 10 years of safety. It stopped Saladin's advance for a time and showed how strong and brave the Crusader state could be. But the Battle of Montgisard wasn't a miracle, it was a lesson in strategy. It showed how a smart leader could use speed, surprise, and the land itself to beat a much bigger army. It proved that a small, disciplined, and determined force could win against a larger and overconfident one. Most of all, It was a victory born from the unbreakable will of a young king who refused to let his kingdom die. Of course, the peace didn't last forever. Saladin was too skilled to stay defeated. He learned from his failure, rebuilt his armies, and came back stronger. 10 years later, in 1187, he took his final revenge at the Battle of Hattin, a terrible defeat for the Crusaders that led to the fall of Jerusalem. But that is a story for another time. The legacy of Montgisard doesn't belong to the man who eventually won the war. It belongs to the man who won that one impossible day. It belongs to the Leper King who, crippled by disease and facing destruction, chose not to hide but to ride straight into history. The Battle of Montgisard remains one of history's greatest underdog victories, a powerful lesson in leadership, strategy, and how courage can change everything, even against impossible odds. What do you think? What's your favorite part of this amazing story? Let us know in the comments. And if you want to see more tactical breakdowns of history's most fascinating battles, make sure you subscribe and hit that notification bell. Thanks for watching.